never invest in infrastructure that causes harm. The fastest growing economy in the world today is Guyana because of their oil and gas discoveries. I think we need to turn our heads towards the other energy carriers to say, are we using the endowment we have, for example, of gas and oil? And we do have a South Africa.
Privilege compounds and prejudice equally compounds.
Welcome to Energy Conversations, powered by Kani Development Solutions and the African Energy Leadership Center at the Wits Business School.
Welcome to Energy Conversations. This season, we're moving from policy to participation, how South Africa's energy sector actually works and where you fit in it. When a substation goes up near your town, when a wind farm is constructed or a water treatment plant is upgraded, who funds it? Where does that money come from? Who decides? And what decisions do they weigh up before a single brick is laid? Today, we're inside the institution at the center of those decisions, the Development Bank of Southern Africa. And my guest is the DBSA's Group Executive for Programs, Dr. Phindile Masangane. Dr. Phindile, welcome and thank you for being part of this conversation.
Thokozile, thank you so much and thank you for inviting me. Before we start, I just want to say a hearty congratulations for this platform. Very, very informative. You bringing what the energy sector is about to the people. You keeping us informed, even as the people who are participating in the sector. We really found this very, very valuable. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I might shed some thug tears. Thank you so much for that. Oh, completely got me off guard.
Really useful platform for us.
Thank you. So let's start with the question, in terms of this question centering around who funds it, So every South African lives with infrastructure every day, right? So power, water, roads, connectivity, but very few think about how these systems are actually financed. So my question is, when a substation comes up or a power plant comes up, where does this money actually come from?
So it comes from a number of players. So first and foremost, there is what we call project development. Someone has got to be entrepreneurial enough to identify the opportunity or the need to even build that infrastructure. So that's what we call project development. So someone must identify the need for this infrastructure and then develop it. Project development culminates in what we call project bankability, where you know who's going to be the user of this road, the engineering designs of it, what should it look like, and then importantly, where will the revenue to finance it come from, and what is the cost of that infrastructure, and what is its useful life. So, and in South Africa, and of course, across the continent as well, that is the biggest problem we have, Thokozile and your listeners, in that part of project development requires capital which is at risk. Because at that time, you are saying, I see a need for this. I now need to permit it. I now need to do the basic designs. I now need to quantify what would be needed to build it and how much it will cost to build it until such a time that it's mature for other people to come in. And that capital that is spent at that project development phase, as we call it, is at risk to the developer. Fortunately, they are no longer alone. There is ourselves as the Development Bank of Southern Africa. So we do offer some project preparation funding for this. Now, once that project is developed and now it's bankable, everything is in place, a number of players can now start crowding in. That person that sponsored, that developed the project can now go to the development finance institutions like ourselves. They can go to commercial banks, they can go to other lenders, they can indeed bring in other people who want to participate in the ownership of that infrastructure. That's what we call equity participation. So there is a whole lot of different players that finance this infrastructure, but there is a marked difference between those that want to participate early when the project is still not yet de-risked, and therefore there's a lot of permitting, which stage we call project development. Then there's the part about the execution, which is normally easier to finance because everything is now clear on where the money will come from. The costs are now clear. The permits, which normally one of the big ones is your environmental authorization and licenses that might be required.
Okay. So, I mean, there's a whole architecture behind it, right?
Yeah.
And so could you explain what is the gap that the DBSA then fills, or where in this whole architecture?
The DBSA plays a critical role. It's one of the development finance institutions in the country. Our focus is on infrastructure. And why do I say we play a critical role? DFIs generally are the ones that will look at the need. What does the country need to grow its economy? And therefore, they are the ones that will provide that capital to de-risk the projects. They are the one who sometimes have to pioneer the development of that type of infrastructure. Let me do this by giving you an example. Let me clarify this by giving you an example. In around 1998, the government of the Republic of South Africa identified the need for us to bring in renewable electricity generation. At that time, we were largely coal-based with a little bit of nuclear and some hydro storage. So the government felt that it's important for us to diversify our sources of electricity. Secondly, they found it important that we must have other players in the electricity generation space. How was this going to be done? We had seen other countries doing different things, but what was best for South Africa? No one could answer this question. So we had a project developer coming to South Africa and proposing a wind farm in an area which had a good wind resource, Darling in the Western Cape. And this developer then needed to prepare the project, as I said, permit it and so on. And our international development partners, particularly the Danish government, gave this person the money to do this. But now the project was fully developed. How then do you implement it? The amount of money it needed, and if you look at the revenue that would be required to repay that investment, you compare it to Eskom's cost of generation. Eskom's cost of generation was much, much lower. And therefore, this required a tariff that was much higher than the prevailing market tariff at the day. And that is the critical role that the DBSA played, because this thing is not bankable. But the DBSA then provided patient, long-dated capital so that the money doesn't have to be paid within the conventional or normal time frames, so that it could be patient and enable the development of this new wind farm. So that's the role that we play, and other DFIs, of course, play the same role, but in different sectors. But when it comes to infrastructure, ours is to make sure that we were able to find the right financing instruments to enable the construction of critical economic infrastructure in the country. As I said, this participation that we provided, or the funding we provided, enabled the first wind farm in the country to be built. And Thokozile, what happened after that? After that, we had a reference plant in the country that we could use to then decide how much do this project cost in South Africa, because you can use costs from other countries, but it's not the reality. So all of a sudden we had a reliable in-country cost of doing this project. And it's one of those projects that were used to model and see what is the premium we must pay as a country to introduce this clean, green, renewable electricity generation project without financiers like the DBSA who look at this and think of the long-term future about where the economy is going. We would never have new technologies being introduced.
Sure, that's quite, I mean, it's quite a big role, quite a catalytic role in fact. Given that this is an energy conversation, I want to contextualize the DBSA's role then within the energy landscape in South Africa's landscape? Because obviously you've got government that's playing a role, you've got private financiers, you've got private parties, and then you've got the bank. So where does the DBSA then sit in this, and how do you then as a bank then relate to all of these different players and parties in the ecosystem?
So you've got a number of financiers that participate and enable the building of this infrastructure. As I said, we play a critical role in terms of providing the project preparation that's needed, project preparation funding that's needed in partnership with whoever the sponsor is. But once the project is ready then for execution, that's when everyone else can come in, and we participate in partnership with those people. So we do bring in our own financing instruments, and we participate alongside the commercial banks. We participate alongside private capital, who sometimes take equity participation in the project. So we form part of the ecosystem once a project is mature and once an industry is mature. But our role really is to come up even much earlier to enable these projects to come to the market. And once they are there, we participate alongside everyone else once they've been de-risked. Once the project has been de-risked, normally there is not much of a shortage of capital, and it's easy to crowd in other financiers. So we are part of the financing ecosystem, in short.
Awesome. And also I think maybe it's worth exploring or touching on, and that people might not realize, is that the DBSA is not just writing checks, right? So it's not just about the money. You've got a whole value chain approach as you're speaking to, project planning, the financing, and also implementation support. So why the whole value chain? Why not just a specific part of it and not just focus on the lending?
Because as the DFI, we are owned by the government of the Republic of South Africa. So for us, this is a long-term view. So one of the critical roles we play is to make sure that when the planning is there, we support our government in making sure that the preparation of these projects can be done, and therefore these projects can move from government's plan, because government is thinking about the long term. It's thinking about how will we grow our economy? How can we sustain it? Government is not doing something just for today. We're not building a power plant for today. We're building it for the long term. Secondly, when we build power plants in the country, we have to look at where is demand going? What capacity is required to catalyze economic recovery, for instance? So once the government does have those plans, our role then is to partner and make sure that these projects then become financeable. Let me give you another example. The independent transmission program that we are rolling out now as a country. So it became apparent that the bottleneck now to rolling out this renewable electricity is our transmission grid. So government then looks at this and says, how do we make sure that the transmission infrastructure is rolled out fast enough to enable more of this renewable electricity generation? But at that time, the government has got a constrained balance sheet in terms of providing the guarantee, because this capacity or this grid connectivity will be made available to a state-owned entity, and therefore someone must stand behind that in terms of guaranteeing the land or the loans that are going to go into that. So the role of the DBSA, therefore, is to support government to make sure that that happens, and we then develop the credit enhancement instruments that are needed to make that program a reality. So we cannot, like commercial banks, sit back and say, we will wait until these projects come to the market. No, these are critical economic infrastructure projects. One of the critical roles that the government has for us, and the support and the function that we play, is to make sure that indeed these projects are prepared, they are bankable, and that they can attract the funding from the other financiers. But the person that can do that, the person that can walk this walk of developing the projects and bringing them to bankability, is the DBSA as the infrastructure DFI of the country. So that's our role, and therefore we cannot look at this thing with a single eye of just looking at the financing and say, where is a bankable project? And then I'll come in and provide a loan and make sure that the loan has got a low risk. No, no, no. Us is to look back and say, what does the country need? And for other players, other financiers to come in and finance that infrastructure. What is required? What would make this project bankable? And start to develop that until the project comes to the market, and then it can crowd in the other money from private players, from commercial banks. So we played that important catalytic role in project development or structuring. You know, it doesn't have to be just project development. It can also be structuring, yeah.
Touching on, I mean, again, looking at the South African energy sector, the DBSA played a very key role in establishing the IPP Office as part of the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program. Yeah. Could you talk us through, you know, what exactly did that entail? What did the DBSA do when people say set up the IPP Office? What are we actually saying?
So government made the policy decision to say that we will need a procurer of this power because we were introducing private sector generation capacity for the first time. So once government had made that decision to say, let's have an entity that's going to be responsible for the procurement so that the availability of this generation capacity to Eskom could be done on a competitive basis in line with Section 217 of our Constitution. Therefore, you needed an entity, which is different, of course, from Eskom, that will run the procurement. Hence, the department or government decided to establish the IPP office together with National Treasury. But now it was a case of institutionalization. Where would it sit? And it needs the whole institutional capacity behind it, the governance frameworks, the administrative thing. And it's a new entity, and it's an important entity that's going to procure billions of rands of infrastructure. So you needed to house it within a credible institution, and an institution that has got trusted governance structures. And the DBSA, again, provided that institutionalization framework. So it is currently located within the IPP office is currently located within the DBSA, and in time government may make a decision to have it as a standalone entity. But the role that we've played thus far is to provide the institutional support so that it could do what it is doing so excellently.
Okay, so and beyond, you know, the government programs like the REAP program, there's also, you know, I mean, we're also seeing an uptake in private power generation projects as well, right? And one of the programs that the DBSA has is your embedded generation investment program, which we understand exists to support exactly those kind of projects as well. Could you explain what that program does and why those projects and projects of that kind need DBSA support as well?
So, Thokozile, we've moved beyond having the independent power producers generating electricity exclusively for Eskom. So at one time, South Africa was what we called a single buyer market, where the buyer of this renewable electricity was Eskom. We are now in an era where intensive electricity users can also buy this electricity. And if you look at the private PPAs, as we call them, or the commercial and industrial PPA CNI market, you find that you've got smaller players there that are putting up projects in order to sell to private players. And in some instances, you find that in order for us to crowd in the other lenders, the other financiers, the commercial banks and so on, we need to again come in there and take a large share of that financing, because in such instances you find that the credit enhancement is not there in a similar way in which you have for Eskom. Remember, the Eskom program is guaranteed by government in the event that things do not go the right way. So that's our role there, to make sure that these projects also have funding available for the renewable electricity generation to flourish and to grow outside the public procurement space. So we participate both in the public procurement program as well as in the CNI market. And we've got our development partners. One of the financiers or our line of credit for this is coming through the climate finance community, which is supporting South Africa to make sure that we use cleaner electricity sources.
So I guess it speaks to, it's overall national mandates, what we need to achieve as a country, but it's also then how do we drive industrialization and how do we support industry at the end of the day as well, right? Because those private PPAs and those large users typically they need to also have access to perhaps cheaper power, which then supports competitiveness.
And it's not just the cheapness of the power, it's the cleanliness of the power, because you will realize that while Eskom has done a fantastic job in buying and procuring a lot of renewable electricity, that renewable electricity is coming to a large electricity generation base of Eskom. So in terms of the carbon intensity of our grid, it's still fairly high. Yet these private companies are competing in a world and in an economy that's starting to look at how clean is the electricity you used as an input into your industrial process. So it becomes quicker for that industrial customer to buy directly from the renewable electricity generator, because that power will be largely clean. Of course, they still need some of the supply from Eskom, but if they buy directly, it helps to decarbonize quite quicker. So we have to support that program as well.
Okay. And part of the program, I mean, it specifically speaks to enabling communities and small businesses to be able to take up ownership stakes in these renewable energy projects. Why ownership and not jobs? I mean, obviously both matter, but why specifically ownership?
In actual fact, we're not looking at it from just an ownership perspective, Thokozile. We're looking at it across the value chain. And I think for me, it's important that as South Africans, we don't get obsessed with ownership in this infrastructure. There is a lot of value to be derived, for example, from operating and maintaining that plant. That service is a long-term service and it is actually got a lower risk exposure to owning the power plant. It's completely risk exposure. So no, when we look at this project, our criteria is also looking at how do we make sure that South Africans, particularly Black South Africans, are participating across the value chain. So we're not at all focused on ownership. No. We're looking at who's going to supply the other services, particularly the operations and maintenance. We're looking at who's going to construct this plant. And what we would like to see is to see more Black industrialists participating in this program. And it's not so much about the ownership. In actual fact, personally, I wish that South Africans will participate more in the other services. I find them to be more accessible, and I find them to be of a lower risk than the ownership part.
And it's a good point around ownership as well, because also the challenge is you have this ownership or you've got this equity, but that share certificate comes indebted and you're waiting for, and firstly, pay back the debt on that equity. And that time your partners in the project, they have been making money from shovel. So I think it's a very important point to consider. And again, like these assets, they take a long time for you to really get the full return from an ownership perspective, but it is to then explore that full value chain to say from shovel, when can you actually place yourself in the services of that plant? And I guess to your point as well, the risk is significantly lower. You don't need to go raise a massive amount of equity funding. You just need to be able to, identify what it is that you can supply or what it is you can do in that value chain.
And let me add that even on those services, you still need some capital, and that's where we are willing to partner with South Africans on that. So even as you offer, or as you make an offer, as you make a bid to provide the operations and maintenance, the owners of that plant want to know what if things go wrong, you know, so they still want some guarantees. So, but I'm saying it's more accessible than the ownership side, but you still require capital. I'm not saying that it's all readily available. Also, on the ownership side, what I'm seeing in the market is that because of the intense competition, the returns are getting thinner and thinner. So not only are you waiting long, but those returns are getting thinner. And what we're seeing is now a vertical integration. So owners are now becoming operators. They are now becoming the construction companies as well. So you've got to, as a DBSA, you've got to have a line of sight on how the market movements are starting to develop now with the competition intensifying and so on. So that's why we always watch this thing from a full value chain perspective than just be focused on ownership.
It's not just about cheaper electricity, but it's clean, the cleanliness of it. And that all of this really comes down to, you know, commitments that are made under the Paris Agreement. It all comes down to CBAM. It all comes down to climate. Like, it really goes back. So one of the key programs, or there's a climate finance facility that the DBSA has, and it's been described as the first of its kind in Africa, a green bank model that de-risks climate projects, and in a way, and as we're saying, to crowd in that private investment. Could you translate that for us a bit more?
So the climate finance is a fairly new initiative at the bank, at the DBSA, but it has matured significantly over the last few years. So as you know, climate change is a threat to humanity. And you have the UNFCCC Convention for Climate Change, where countries come together, really came together and signed the Paris Agreement, as you said. Another important part of that is that they came together and then they've got different instruments to help the countries to mitigate against climate change, to adapt. So you've got different financing instruments. You've got the Green Climate Fund, GCF. You've got the Global Environment Facility. There's another facility which has now started to help countries who have already suffered loss and damage. So what the DBSA has done is we've been accredited to act as a fiscal host. So we play that part. But what we do, we don't use those funds necessarily for de-risking a project, but we use those funds to blend the conventional financing that is available for a project. But one has to prove that indeed there is some element of climate mitigation that is going on there. Some of these projects, you actually do a project alongside your infrastructure project. So let me give an example. We've got what we call the water bond, which we did together with RMB. Now, what that one was about was RMB was doing a normal infrastructure bond, raising capital for financing infrastructure for their clients, conventional infrastructure. And then separately, but alongside that, we were also raising funding to make sure that we clean our water, our natural water supply systems. So we funded initiatives to clean the invasive alien plants in the rivers in the Western Cape. What that does is you are then saying to the community and to the world that yes, I'm building this infrastructure, but I'm also making nature resilient. So your infrastructure project has got a positive impact to nature, because along the money that I'm deploying on this economic infrastructure, I'm also deploying capital to make sure that we reinforce our natural ecosystems. So that's what climate financing is about. Some of them goes to conventional infrastructure, but some of it is used to finance biodiversity, is used to finance the natural ecosystem alongside the infrastructure or as it's built.
Before the money moves, right? The question that now we're looking at is that the DBSA is not just saying, I want to see the returns, but the environmental and the social assessments now become quite critical as part of that conversation. And I think this is an example that you've shown in terms of, you know, how you guys are looking at it in these parallel facilities. But in practical terms, so can you go maybe into a bit more detail of how these considerations then get weaved into when we look when we consider how the DBSA looks at various projects?
So obviously, the issue of climate impact is one of our key considerations when we look at a project. What is the impact of this project on the environment, which is why we are probably one of the top financiers when it comes to the renewable energy project, because it helps us to move from a high carbon intensity technologies to low carbon intensity technologies. So that's a given, that there is a shift in the infrastructure that we must build. We're looking for infrastructure that minimizes the impact on the environment. But there's another shift, Thokozile, which is what I think you want me to talk about. A shift towards saying, actually, as we build the infrastructure, it should no longer be just about minimizing the impact to the environment. Can we also make sure that it's actually positive to nature? So we're now talking about nature positive infrastructure. Importantly, we're actually starting to view nature itself as a financeable asset, because when our natural ecosystem is thriving, it helps us to mitigate this impact of severe climate change events. It helps us, so it makes our infrastructure, our man-made infrastructure, to be more resilient in itself. So there is that shift in terms of the financing instruments that are out there. And I think everyone acknowledges the fact that we cannot ignore anymore this climate change impact, because it would not be wise for anyone to finance this infrastructure when actually it's at a risk of these severe climate change events. So one way of doing that is we're saying, let's use cleaner ways of doing our business, let's use cleaner ways of generating electricity, but also importantly, let's start taking care of nature, so that as we build this infrastructure, we're also helping our natural ecosystem to thrive. Because when this natural ecosystem thrives, it helps us to cushion against climate change events. And therefore, it starts to protect the very infrastructure that we're investing in. So all investors are now starting to understand that it is very, very important for us now to start literally investing in nature. Yes, we've taken a significant step, and we've made significant progress in making sure we now use low carbon intensity technologies. But now we must start to rebuild our natural ecosystems again. And that's where the DBSA is also participating in.
And that's a very key, I mean, even if we think about it contractually, so most of these contracts will have your force majeure provisions, right? Acts of God, nature. But it all then comes back to, we're now looking at financing from a perspective of how do we mitigate the very acts of God that we want to potentially rely on at a later point. So I think it's quite an interesting way to look at it. I mean, I think we recently saw, I think it was the Ilanga CSP plant, where we saw, I think, severe rainstorm, which actually then started destroying the asset itself. And it's quite interesting in that the biggest risk to these assets, or a key risk to this asset, is nature in itself. So how do you keep investing in assets if you're not going to be thinking about the big risk that these assets are then daily exposed to, right?
And nature had a way of providing us with nature services. So if you look, for example, at your wetlands, when you've got a flood, those act as a sponge and protect downstream areas, because the water will come there and the excess water will come there and be sponged up. And then during dry periods, that water will be slowly released. So, and another good example, recently, we've seen the city of Paris being focused in planting more trees and actually removing all the paving in the city to make it more greener. And as they do that, it helps to cool down the city as the city starts to warm. So it's very, very important, as you are saying, to use nature to be one of the mitigants against these extreme climate change events. And that in itself is protecting the very infrastructure that we're building. And we've got in our bank our climate finance unit that is starting to look more into these things to say, as the DBSA, as we lead financing into the infrastructure, let's also look at a way of financing the natural ecosystem and make it vibrant, because that's what's going to help us to fight this climate change events.
Okay. I want to, and obviously from a public's perspective, there's like this tension that arises, right? Because we urgently need this energy, we urgently need this infrastructure, but at the same time, it has these environmental costs. So from a DBSA's perspective, if I'm understanding you, you know, the balance is then investing in it, but as well, but almost, I guess from a DBSA's perspective, is there ever a trade-off even? Do you guys find yourself in a position when you kind of have to just trade off between the urgent need, but also the environmental costs?
I haven't seen a project where we've had to do a trade-off per se, but I think all project sponsors, and one of our criteria is to look at, is this infrastructure we are building, so while it supports economic growth, and that's one of our key focus areas, but equally important to us is that it must not damage the environment. That's a basic and a basic assessment area for us, and we never compromise on that, and we will never say let's develop this infrastructure because it's supporting economic growth, even though we can see it's harmful to the environment. No. So for us, it's always first prize, let's not do any harm and let's make sure. But now what we're saying is let's go beyond that. Let's now invest in nature and make sure that we revitalize our natural ecosystem as well, to help us to mitigate the impact against this man-made infrastructure that we build. So environmental impact and its implications for our infrastructure project is a key evaluation criteria for us. We will never invest in infrastructure that causes harm.
And I suppose that's why you have this Green Climate Fund accreditation.
Exactly,
I would imagine
precisely.
It has to be at the heart of this.
It has to be at the heart of it. And I think that there are, even including the way in which we design this project, I think people, developers, engineers are now starting to be sensitized about, guys, let's build in a manner that minimize. So sometimes it's not about the emissions, but it's about how you do it. And how do you also then build and engineer in a manner that you coexist that infrastructure with nature and make sure that it's actually nature positive than not damaging or even just neutral. Let's just be consciously and intentionally make sure that the infrastructure we build is nature positive.
You know, when we think about infrastructure and energy and what the public experiences or who the public interfaces with most is your municipalities, right? And municipalities have some challenges. How does the, DBSA work with municipalities or in that space? Is there any involvement at all from the DBSA from that perspective?
Yes, actually, we work with municipalities a lot. And they are a biggest share of our loan book. So as a development finance institution, that's our role, to make sure that our public institutions like the municipalities have access to funding. Otherwise, the commercial banks will always cherry pick. And I'm not sure that they will pick municipalities. So we're there for them. We help them with the planning. So when it comes to infrastructure, we do planning with them. We support them to prepare those projects to make sure that they are bankable and they're financeable by ourselves or the commercial banks as well. Talking to energy right now, we are supporting them to make sure that are they in a position in this liberalized energy environment, that energy market that we are entering as South Africa? How do they make sure that they still are a critical player? So we work with a number of municipalities to look into what projects are coming up in their space, how can they be financed. So we'd like to see a situation where municipalities remain a key player in the energy space, because that is their constitutional right as well, and it's one of those services that they have to provide. Otherwise, we run a risk as a country if we leave this to private sector players, where those who cannot afford will then be left behind.
Take it back to directly our listeners, right? So
Yeah.
throughout this conversation, we've seen that infrastructure development and projects, they don't start at construction. There's a whole process,
yes.
there's a whole system, you know, and they begin with that preparation. So if you could leave our listeners with one message, you know, in terms of what a young person or an entrepreneur or a community member needs to understand today, right, around infrastructure development, in order for them to be ready for tomorrow's opportunities and tomorrow's economic growth opportunities, what would that message be?
The key message I would leave with community people, with entrepreneurs, with young people, is to say that infrastructure development, infrastructure financing is a long-term game. And the focus should not just be on the ownership participation as we're talking about. They can start by working somewhere and develop the skills. Now that enables them and capacitates them to come and run these companies in their own right with that capability. Because financiers, including ourselves as DFIs, will always ask ourselves, what is it that you have? So let's make sure that as a people, we are also developed and we know what is it that will bring to the table when we say that we must participate. Because when you've got that track record of having worked in another power plant somewhere else, the financiers will look at you positively when you come and say, listen, I've started my own business. I now want to run that other power plant and be the operations and maintenance contractor for that. Or I want to be the one that builds. But you've got to have that skill somewhere. So for me, I think it's about us making sure that we capacitate ourselves as a people. And then to the community, and we're starting to look at this, how do we make sure that some of these assets are socially owned and the communities are participating? I think it's time to have an honest conversation about what does that ownership look like. I'm just never sometimes, Thokozile, when I hear those conversations, that people might have an expectation that money will flow into the different households. That are, no, this is about developing our community. So it's quite possible that actually those cash flows from that project that is socially owned is there to build the other infrastructure that the community needs. It could be that that's what we need to build the bridges. It could be that's what we need to build the schools. It could be that's what the community needs. It's those revenues from the socially owned electricity generation plant that the community can use to make sure, for example, they participate in the digital economy, you know, to bring in the digital infrastructure that they need, rather than each person then getting a small share of that ownership. So what I'm trying to say is we have to rethink about what does social ownership of these projects mean. And I think if we understand that it's for the good of the community and that the cash flows can be used to uplift the community, I'll sleep easier at night. That's my advice, to say whenever we think about socially owned or community benefits, let's make sure that we leave those at a community level rather than to start to selfishly think, what is it that I can get? But as individuals, let's be capacitated to participate in these projects, because they are quite large projects and they are there for 30, 50 years. So they can provide an avenue for you to make a livelihood. But you've got to get the skills, you've got to be patient and make sure that when you participate, there's something that you're bringing to the table.
I like the point you're making about, you know, individual capacitation of self first, because at the end of the day, it's that you know, it's like they say in the Bible, what's in your hand, and you have to make sure that what's in your hand, you're constantly cultivating it so that you are then available for the opportunity. You're not going to wake up one day and say, I'm running, or I have an IPP, or I have a construction business. You have to start somewhere by, okay, let me see if I can get a job on site. Let me see if I can, and I think what we almost need to reinstill in the next generation is that it's not a quick win to the end. There's some investment you need to take, and maybe you're not there yet, but you have to take this step, because that step will allow you and unlocks, almost looking at it as like a game. each level unlocks the next level by you actually completing what is needed for your level and what you can and making sure you're gaining as much from each of those experiences. I think that's a very important point to have made on that. And then I think secondly, community ownerships or community trusts, I think and then it's a topical thing. And I think one of the challenges we're having with community trusts is, these are the investment vehicles in the communities. We can think about what are the IPPs going to do or what are the contractors going to do, but the bulk of the cash that's sitting in those community trusts really is intended to support that community. And I think it's for us to take a collective view. I mean, I'm fortunate enough to sit and chair one of these community trusts, and I had an engagement earlier this week, and you're in the community, and to your point, some members are saying, I've been forgotten. But what's amazing to see is collectively in the community, people saying, no, but can we have something that's for us all, a street light, or can we have a multi-set? And I think when you have that kind of thinking, that's how you can actually maximize the development impact, that we can all align on saying we are supporting this initiative because this initiative is actually going to ensure that young people are not out on the streets and getting into trouble, or it's going to ensure that we've sorted out GBV, but that collectively let our community be better for it. And I think there's a lot more work we need to do with communities around this. And there's a lot more structure I think we need to ensure that once these projects are gone, those communities must look different.
Oh, that's
Like,
very important.
Fundamentally.
And in Thokozile, these power generation plants provide that opportunity, and we just have to be good stewards of them. I think I would be so happy, and I think they would have served their purpose if we use them to develop the community and have other projects that have got a wider impact on the community. One of the things that keep me awake at night is, are we not going to leave some communities behind as we move to a digital economy as a world? And how do you have that digital access to those communities? And if we are not intentional about using the projects that are there in the communities to make sure that you uplift the community and it participates in this digital future, that it has the right education system and the right education infrastructure so that the future generation can participate. But if we look at them and we look at those projects for individual benefits, unfortunately, we're just not going to reap those rewards.
And the point that you're even making from a digital perspective, right? Because it's, privilege compounds and prejudice equally compounds. And what we're not seeing is a young person in a remote community in the Eastern Cape who does not have access to digital services, never mind access to ChatGPT that their counterpart in Johannesburg would have. What are you creating? What divide kind of just keeps increasing? It just keeps widening, and we really need to be looking at closing that. But Dr. Phindile, thank you so very much for this conversation. In fact, before we close off, what is something that you would want to share or discuss that you feel we haven't discussed in this episode, but that you would love to just air out?
I think when we talk about energy, and this is one of the biggest platforms that talk about that, as I said, I think we've had a high focus on electricity supply. I think as a country, we need to turn our heads towards the other energy carriers. I'm talking here about gas, for example. Much as it's a fossil fuel, it's a cleaner fossil fuel. What it does for other countries is to provide a big opportunity for industrialization, for economic growth. The fastest economic growing country, the fastest growing economy in the world today is Guyana, because of their oil and gas discoveries. Namibia, right next to us, is on track to double their economy. I know it's a small economy, but imagine doubling your economy in 2040. It gives the country an opportunity to use those revenues to invest in other things and to modernize their economy. So I think we've spent a lot of time as South Africa, and rightly so, because of where we are, focused on electricity. I think we need to turn our heads towards the other energy carriers to say, are we using the endowment we have, for example, of gas and oil, and we do have as South Africa, are we using that optimally to develop our economy? There are technologies now that allow you to exploit those energy resources without causing the negative impact on the environment. So I think we're not having enough conversation around the other energy carriers. And that's my challenge to you, to please bring the next speaker to talk about what are the other energy opportunities and not just electricity.
I will definitely, certainly be doing that. Challenge accepted. Challenge very, very, very much accepted. But thank you so much. Thank you very much, Dr. Phindile. And that really brings us to the end of this episode of Energy Conversations. And I think what really stuck out for me, or some key principles that stuck out for me, in that behind every transmission line, every power plant, there's an entire ecosystem that is actually at work to really bring this to life. The planning around it, the financing around it, but not just the players that are supporting this ecosystem, but there's the ecosystem itself, which is nature. And I think a very clear message that also came out very clearly in this conversation is that as we continue to develop our infrastructure, as we continue to develop our energy sector, we need to be doing so in a nature positive way, because that is what's actually going to ensure that we are there as humanity to enjoy all of this growth. And this really brings us to the end of this episode of Energy Conversations. If this has helped you better understand the sector, better understand the system, better understand an organization like the DBSA, please share it with your loved ones or somebody within your network, so that we can keep growing and keep continuing this very important conversation. I'm Thokozile Zambane. This is Energy Conversations, and until next time, let's keep the conversation going.
Thank you for listening to Energy Conversations, powered by Kani Development Solutions and the African Energy Leadership Center at the Wits Business School.